Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you, Deb. Thank you to all of you for being here tonight. It's just a real privilege to get to sit up here with you, Dr. Fiona Hill, and also to be in person, to have this type of conversation. It feels much more impactful for me personally, and so I'm just grateful to see so many of you here tonight. So, welcome. I want to just start by reflecting on when Joe invited me to moderate this event several months ago. I immediately imagined moderating a conversation with a remarkable scholar and public servant and woman leader who I and many of you in the room had watched stand up during the impeachment proceedings for President Donald Trump and speak in clear and intelligent and thoughtful terms about what you had experienced and seen. And of course, the last 3 weeks have really changed, I think, the course of why many of us are here tonight and added another layer. Of course, in the last 3 weeks, we've watched Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. We've seen 3 million Ukrainians seek safety across Ukraine's borders. We've seen many more seek safety in bunkers within the country and in parts of the country that are safer than some others. We've seen hundreds of civilians lose their lives, thousands of combatants, and in President Zielinski's address to the US Congress this morning, he reminded us that many of these are children, and the toll of the children that have been lost is likely to unfortunately increase after the bombing of the theater in Mariupol today. So it's with that heaviness that I want to start simply by reflecting on the human suffering that brings us, I think, to this conversation tonight. And to also invite you, Dr. Hill, to help us better understand and to start us off tonight by really setting the stage for how did we get here? How did we come to this moment of so much fear and so much grief?
Well, look, very sadly, we came here because of Vladimir Putin. And I just want to actually apologize to everyone who's sitting over here, slightly with my back turned to you. I'll try to turn around and not fall off the stool at the same time, but I guess we're positioned for the cameras here for the live streaming. But I do want to make sure as I turn, can everybody still hear if I move about a bit? Okay. So I noticed that Joe had picked a picture for the program tonight, which is me sitting next to Vladimir Putin. And this was actually some time ago. And I kind of thought to myself, not a great picture really for tonight, is it? Because there's a different kind of story about that dinner that might give a different picture to Vladimir Putin. So there was a couple of occasions when I went to, and I'll just tell this story first, because it just kind of in some respects fits the guy who's made this kind of decision. On 2 occasions, I found myself seated next to Vladimir Putin at dinners that were organized by the Kremlin as part of something called the Valdai Discussion Club. And these were really propaganda exercises to bring in experts, people like myself, journalists and others, with the whole intent, oops, that's got a bit of an echo. Okay, yep. With the whole intent of trying to influence us and inform us about things that were going on in Russia, but in the hope that we would come away rather sympathetic towards Putin and the ideas and whatever propaganda it was that they were trying to pass on. And on the first couple of occasions, I was writing a book about Putin, Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. So, of course, the opportunity to go to these was very important because I get the chance to observe him close up. I was also actually in the government on a couple of these occasions at the National Intelligence Office of Russia. So you can imagine that my government colleagues wanted me to take in absolutely everything about him. Because I was actually sitting right here, and you can see there in the picture. And I wondered, why was I sitting next to Putin? Was I the least likely person to stab him in the thigh with a fork? Was I, because, I was, at the time I was National Intelligence Officer, was this, were they trying to compromise me? It was like Judi Dench in M, it was kind of all these things were going through my head here. And it turned out, and the reason I'm starting with a slightly humorous thing, because it tells you an awful lot about him and the whole Kremlin. It turned out it was because I was a woman. They didn't care what kind of woman I was, although I was wearing at that point a slightly floral jacket. But I was a woman who was neither too young, nor too old, nor too attractive, nor too ugly, and basically no one was going to pay any attention to me. So I was actually a piece of decoration. I was, thanks to the floral jacket, basically a plant on the table, because all eyes had to be on the great man. And if a man had been sitting next to him, people would say, well, who's that man? Why is he sitting next to Vladimir Putin? Is he important? As a woman there, yeah, who cares? That's all eyes on Vladimir Putin. And on the other side of him was another woman who happened to be one of his press people. So people just assumed, the people who didn't know who I was, which was most people, that this was just another press person just, there to support him and, kind of if he ever needed anything. And so this brings into focus another part of how we got here, that Putin, everything is catered to Putin in and around the Kremlin. All of this staging of Vladimir Putin, all eyes on Putin. And the whole run-up to this war, all eyes have been on Putin. He's made the decision to invade. He had other options. He was amassing a massive military force, and of course the US government decided to tell everybody that they anticipated that he was going to invade, and invasion was imminent. I mean, a lot of people didn't want to believe this. But an invasion was imminent because they believed that he had made this decision, he personally. So we are dealing with a situation, how we got here, that has all been shaped by one man. His background, his thinking, his fears, his perceptions, his goals, his ambitions, and his views of Ukraine, Russian history, his views of the West, of Nato. This is on him. This is not on the Russian people, it's on another group around him, of similarly minded people, security officials in the intelligence services, in the Russian military, who have made this decision in a clandestine fashion with him. Obviously we found out about this. But the whole framing is really about Vladimir Putin, and how this ends is really up to him as well. And the big dilemma is now how we get ourselves out of it, but he got us into it.
One of the things that you've written about, and I've heard you speak about in other contexts, is this history of myth-making that Vladimir Putin has been deeply involved with, going back in history to these stories, from the archives of the Russian Empire, and reappropriating and distorting some of that history to make his plan today. And I'm wondering if you can share with us a bit more about that process, and how that might give us some indication of where this is going to go. Really, what is Putin's endgame?
Well, I'll take the endgame first and then move backwards, sadly. Putin intends to subjugate Ukraine at this point. He's not looking for, we keep talking about this off-ramp in the press. He wants us to take an off-ramp and basically move away from this and negotiate away Ukraine's independence and sovereignty, as well as recognise already the dismemberment of Ukraine. Because remember, he's already invaded Ukraine before, annexed Crimea, and started off a war in the Donbass region. And in the run-up to this invasion, the Russian parliament, the Russian Duma, recognised the independence of the two breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. So, this is already underway, the dismemberment, going back to 2014. And, so we're already there in part of the whole endgame. Putin sees Ukraine as unfinished business. And it's clear that although he has spun this idea that Ukrainians and Russians are one and the same people, that there are Russian speakers in Ukraine that ought to be part of Russia, that Russian territory belongs to Russia, the way that he's now conducting the war suggests that he's more trying to punish the Ukrainians, treating them as enemies, not as a fraternal people or part of one people, but as maybe even traitors, people who have to be crushed. So how did we get to this? Because the Ukrainians don't want to be part of Putin's artificial Russian world that he's conjured up, because he does call it the Russian world, the Ruski Mir. Putin has spent an awful lot of time teaching himself Russian history. He wasn't a historian. He was a lawyer, in terms of he studied legal history. And then he entered the KGB, different kind of pathway to success and to power. And he reads all the time Russian history. I don't know whether he reads world history, but he certainly reads Russian history, and he's put his own slant and interpretation on it. One of the things that he reads about Russian history gets back to the point that I made, that all eyes are on Putin. He sees that the Russian political culture always centers around one man, occasionally one woman, like Catherine the Great, back in the Tsarist period, the Great Empress of Russia, who happened to actually be German. But in any case, Putin speaks German as well. So I think sometimes he kind of fancies himself as Catherine the Great, not just as one of the other Russian Tsars or Soviet leaders. But his view is that the presidency in Russia is, in many respects, like a constitutional monarch, but without any checks and balances. And one of the people who Putin used to work with very closely was his old law professor at Leningrad State University, Anatoly Sobchak, who then became the mayor of independent St. Petersburg after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the first elected mayor, and took Vladimir Putin on to be a deputy mayor. Now, Sobchak is really important because Sobchak was one of the legal scholars who helped draw up the Russian constitution in the 1990s. And he was a scholar of constitutional law during the Tsarist period, of the efforts to create a constitutional monarchy out of the autocracy in Russia. And, Putin studied with this guy, and basically Sobchak's whole idea was that the Russian presidency should have really strong executive powers and really be beholden to no one. The parliament isn't a check on it. The president doesn't belong to a political party. And in many respects, the people are kind of the subjects of the president. They legitimize him and give him their support. But basically, all of the power flows down, not up. And this is what the Ukrainians don't want. So over the last 30 years of their independence from the Soviet Union, Ukraine has been a messy politics, absolutely. They've got their oligarch class, there's been a lot of corruption, but there's also been a lot of political change. They've had frequent, not just, kind of uprisings and, presidents in Ukraine, going through protests, but also had elections. They've had multiple changes of presidency. And as Zielinski shows, kind of Ukrainians are now with the view that anyone could be president in Ukraine, just like we have that view here, right? And President Zielinski is a comedian who played a school teacher, like Deb, a school principal, school teacher, who then actually gets the chance to become president after basically a rant about the corruption and the problems in Ukraine goes viral, and he gets asked to run for president. Now, basically life is imitating art, and he is president, and he's the everyman president. And we're seeing that, now as he's stepping up into the fray. But the whole point is that Ukrainians don't want to be the subjects of the Russian ruler anymore. After 30 years, they want to be their own people. They want to go off in a different direction. And Vladimir Putin is basically saying you have no right to do that. So he's got to the point where he now clearly wants to punish them for resisting, for, basically denying his ability to quickly turn things around. He clearly thought that he would invade very quickly, blitzkrieg, couple of days. Look, we all thought it as well. We all thought that the Ukrainian forces wouldn't be able to hold the Russians off for more than 48 hours, 56, 72 hours at best, maybe a few days. What day are we now? I mean, we're getting into this, into weeks, at this point. And we're looking like we're in a grinding war because the Ukrainians are fighting back. They're fighting back for the right to be citizens of their own country, just as we would, if we were invaded.
Right. Yeah, it's remarkable. In President Zielinski's address to the U.S. Congress just this morning, which perhaps some of you have had a chance to watch, I mean, he addressed our Congress people with the same sort of candor and straightforwardness that he's become very famous for. And of course, in this address to U.S. Congress, repeated one of the demands that he and many others in Ukraine have been making, which is that I believe the quote was something like, Russia has turned our skies into death, calling for a no-fly zone. And this is, a very a step that the Biden administration has strongly resisted. And many experts are fearful that the enactment of a no-fly zone could lead to a direct military confrontation between the U.S. or NATO and Russia. But I'm just wondering, kind of from where you sit, whether we are doing enough from the U.S. perspective. Are we doing enough to support Zielinski, to support this Ukrainian dream of a democratic and free state?
So just to be very clear, a no-fly zone would absolutely mean that we are engaging with Russian forces. Because for a no-fly zone, you have to be willing to shoot down planes. And one thing is also that the Russian and Ukrainian planes are pretty much the same planes. So we'd have a very hard time because from a distance, you can't see if they've got a Ukrainian flag on the side. These planes don't have a way of distinguishing. And we've already seen in many other combat situations accidents. The Turks, during the conflict in Syria, shot down a Russian plane. And there was a real standoff between Russia and Turkey. The Syrians shot down a Russian plane by accident, thinking that they were shooting at an Israeli plane in Syria. The Russians blamed the Israelis, for being in the same airspace, for example. And there was no-fly zone in Syria. So we can see quite easily that it would immediately imply that we, NATO, somebody, would be shooting down Russian planes that is not Ukrainian. And we would either be doing that through direct sorties of military planes from Germany or Poland or somewhere close by, or using surface-to-air missiles from somewhere. Basically missiles guided towards shooting down planes. So that's kind of basically what the decision is. So do we want to be engaged immediately in an air war, which would then be a war, a full direct war with Russia? Now, are we doing enough for Ukraine? I mean, I think this is, a very difficult question for me to answer, because, unfortunately, it's the Ukrainians who are having to fight with the Russians. Now, we're seeing all kinds of aid going in, military aid, lethal aid, we're terming it, and obviously ammunition and missiles. The Turks are sending drones, which, in many respects are, conducting an air war with, non-manned aerial vehicles and shooting at tanks, etc. We've got a lot of fighters going into Ukraine. This is becoming the Spanish Civil War of our era. International fighters, lots of Ukrainians. I mean, again, before this refugee crisis of what were about 3 million Ukrainians fleeing into, mostly women and children, fleeing into Poland and Romania and elsewhere, you already had 1 million Ukrainians living in Poland, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians living in Germany, the United Kingdom, elsewhere in Europe. And, when I last looked, there was 50,000 had gone back just in a matter of weeks to fight. And there are even more now. And you've got a lot of other people who don't want to, watch this happen who are going in. It's already getting very complicated to manage. We've got a lot of relief assistance. I mean, I have lots of friends. I had a friend from the north of England, from my own town, who, former military guy, got a whole load of medical equipment. He works for a hospital in Wales, piled into several vans, and they drove all the way from Cardiff in Wales across the border with Romania into Ukraine to deliver the relief supplies. A friend who basically has connections with an organisation that produces mobile hospitals for the National Health Service in the UK, sent all of those, to the front. You've got all kinds of people doing something, and as Stan has already said, we can all contribute something here. In Colorado and elsewhere, I mean, everybody's just 1 or 2 degrees of separation away from a Ukrainian or somebody who knows somebody in Ukraine who's suffering from all of this. And this is the one thing that Putin and even our own government can't possibly have calculated, which is the response of ordinary people and networks of people. And it's the power of a democracy. It's the power of a kind of horizontally networked society like ours, that we actually all have the capability, we have the independent agency to get together and actually do something. The biggest, problem is really coordinating all of it. And, I mean, again, that also can take on unpredictable elements when it's not just relief and, organising, funding and looking after refugees and orphans. And, the Israeli government has basically taken out several thousand Ukrainian orphans, not just Jewish children, but others as well, for example, because, during World War II, so many Jews were also rescued from similar predicaments. So everybody is responding in different ways. But once we have foreign fighters going in, things can get unpredictable, pretty fast. And the Russians right now are kind of looking for an excuse to, present this as the proxy conflict that they've been sort of saying it is with NATO. So we have to tread extremely carefully. We want to help Ukraine. We want to head this off. We have to have really concerted diplomacy. We have to spend 24/7 on this. But we have to be very careful not to feed into the framing that Vladimir Putin has tried to tell the rest of the world, which is this isn't about Ukraine, he's telling everyone. This is about the aggression of NATO expanding up to Russian borders. This is the United States always trying to bring Russia down. The sanctions are all about the West, always trying to constrain Russia since time immemorial, talking about going back in history. When he annexed annexed Crimea in 2014, in March of that year, Putin had a major speech. You can kind of go back and look at the transcript of it. And he took everybody back to the 18th century, to the period of Catherine the Great, when she actually annexed Crimea from the Ottoman Empire. And he basically says, since that period, the West, that time it was Europe, has always been out to get us. They never wanted Russia to succeed. They never wanted Russia to have its place in Europe. And essentially saying that this is the latest iteration of it. It's that myth-making about history. And he's trying to tell the Chinese and the Indonesians and the Indians and everybody who's been sitting out, kind of watching this or, maybe being supportive of China, that this is all about Russia and the West and Ukraine is collateral damage. And this is about, though, Russia, Putin, personally, trying to subjugate Ukraine. He said he wants the Ukrainian army to lay down their weapons. He wants them to overthrow their government. He wants them to surrender. He's making it crystal clear, really, what he's trying to do.
Right. I think you've been so clear and so helpful in really putting the blame and the attention on Putin as an actor. And I'm still wondering if you can help us explain or help us understand, what is the role of NATO in Putin's sort of aggression in this context? What is the history there, and in what ways has NATO been involved to some extent in alarming the Russian security forces?
The whole issue with Ukraine and Russia and NATO is all pretty complicated. So the pressure on Ukraine really starts from the very beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Ukraine becomes an independent state. So before NATO comes into the picture at all. So I just want everybody to bear that in mind. Because NATO doesn't start expanding until 1999. And in the early part of the 1990s, Ukraine found itself, like Belarus and Kazakhstan, overnight unexpectedly a nuclear power. Because after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there were all the missiles that had been positioned in other parts of the Soviet Union on the periphery, with Europe or kind of elsewhere in the case of Kazakhstan, and suddenly they become nuclear states, successor states to the Soviet Union with a nuclear arsenal. We were extraordinarily worried at that period about loose nukes. Some of you here will remember that. And there was a whole program, Senators Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar, that was set up. Many of you may have even worked on that. There's plenty of people around here in Denver who have given the role of Denver during the Cold War. And our focus was on trying to get Ukraine, Belarus and Kazakhstan to give up the nuclear weapons, to have them dismantled. And in return for that, we gave Ukraine, which was now clearly a useless guarantee of its independence, territorial integrity and sovereignty, the UK, the United States and Russia, because there was a number of Russian nationalist politicians. At this point, Putin wasn't there. He was deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, who were already basically saying Ukraine didn't have the right to independence and certainly didn't have the right to be a nuclear power, and were putting a lot of threats on Ukraine, including about retaking Crimea. So that's all before we get to the whole issue of NATO expansion or enlargement. And there was a lot of debates, and I remember them as well, about whether it was a wise idea to enlarge NATO at the end of the Cold War. Russia would view this as provocative because, of course, NATO was a Cold War instrument meant to contain and constrain the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, not just to defend against it. The Warsaw Treaty Organization disappeared right away at the end of the Cold War. And many Russians thought, well, why hasn't NATO disappeared? We created some mechanisms, the Partnership for Peace, to have military-to-military ties with Russia and many of the former Soviet states and Eastern European countries. And we were hoping that would, it's called Partnership for Peace, right? We kind of hope that will work out well. But what happened instead is a number of European countries, first Poland, the Czech Republic and Hungary, all three of which had been invaded by the Soviet forces during uprisings, 56 in Hungary, 68 in Czechoslovakia, and in the 80s in Poland, when they all wanted to do pretty much what Ukraine is trying to do today, which is move off in a different direction, but they were still in the Soviet orbit. They were the first 3 countries to want to join NATO. So as the East came to the West, it wasn't that the West just necessarily expanded out. There's a whole debate in the 1990s. Now, what we should have been mindful of was, again, all the time about how Russia would react. Because people like Putin, who was steeped in the Cold War, someone like Putin who'd been in the KGB and had always been fighting with the main opponent, the West, NATO, the United States, was always going to view this very suspiciously. And in 1999, just as we were about to have the enlargement of NATO to Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, we're also in the midst of the wars in the Balkans. And we have Serbia, the ethnic cleansing, genocide of Kosovo Albanians. We've had all the terrible things happening in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And of course, there is a decision, after much deliberation and pressure, but like our whole discussions now about no-fly zones, to intervene. Because no longer, we couldn't stand by any longer to watch just the slaughter, the kind of things that are happening out here now. So many of you will remember, Richard, we were talking about this over dinner. We decide, the US intervenes. As part of a NATO operation, we bomb Belgrade. We also happened to accidentally bomb the Chinese embassy at the same time. And Stan was actually, there in Beijing when this happened. I happened to be in St. Petersburg at the time at a conference. And every Russian at the conference, even those who were really supporters of things like Partnership for Peace and, closer relationships with the West, were alarmed by this. Because they said, well, hang on, there wasn't an Article 5 trigger here. Serbia didn't attack a member of NATO. This was an internal conflict. And, the kind of explanation that was given, I was the assistant to the conference, the rapporteur, so I wasn't the one who was giving the talk. But, the people who were didn't come up with a very good explanation. And, from that point on, all Russians become deeply suspicious about what NATO and NATO intentions are. And we use NATO in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya. In each case, with the exception of Afghanistan and 9/11, there wasn't really a trigger for Article 5. And so people like Putin look at this, and as soon as there's a talk about Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO, immediately starts to think, is NATO then going to become a problem for us? Could NATO be used against us? Could, as he says, Ukraine be used as a launching pad for some action, thinking back to 1999 and Belgrade? Now, we would say, absolutely not. We couldn't possibly envisage any of the circumstances in which this would happen. But for people like Putin, who's got a pretty dark view of this in any case, this seems to him, kind of a very likely event. He always looks at things and believes if someone has the capability and the capacity to do some harm to Russia, they were likely to do it because he had the capacity and the capability. In our case, he would do it. He always believes that, might have not the intent at some point, but as he always said, circumstances will change. In fact, that's what he said when they annexed Crimea in 2014. When people pushed back about, well, what about the Budapest Memorandum? He said, circumstances have changed. So we didn't fully appreciate, let's just put it this way, the way that people like Putin and the hard guys around him in the Kremlin were really thinking about this. Now, could we have addressed all of this? We have a problem, and I don't want to keep on talking, because you would ask a kind of another question here, but we've got to remember that Putin's been in power for 22 years. In all that time, he's had about, 4 or 5 US presidents, several NATO secretary generals, kind of complete changes, across Europe and elsewhere. For Putin, it's always important to have someone to talk to that he thinks, in his view, talk to, so listen to him, hear him, understand what he's telling them. And we've just not had that kind of continuity. And so Putin has just built up a kind of head of steam of grievances, because he's just, for the last 22 years, he's seen things darkly. We've never been consistent. People come and go. And from his point of view, we're never serious. We're never addressing his concerns. And, at this particular point, I just think he, after 2 years of COVID, here we are. We're just happy to have, get together again. Putin's got so frustrated that he just thinks, right, that's it. I'm taking Ukraine.
Right. And in that case, with this kind of laser focus on Ukraine right now, coming from Putin's perspective, what's the off ramp, right? How do we see this resolve? Is there a threshold at which Putin accepts a ceasefire? right? And you know, I'm hoping that you say yes, and I'm worried about what you're about to say.
Yeah, I'm actually going to say I really don't know at this point, because I mean, what we're trying to do is sort of test whether there is, you know, kind of a threshold. And you know, what I fear, unfortunately, you know, we were talking, you know, in another, you know, event about, you know, Sun Tzu, The Art of War, and the golden bridge that you always have to provide for your adversary. Well, the best I can come up with is a very rusty old bridge that maybe has a bit of, you know, gold paint here and there, which isn't very satisfying at all. Because, you know, right now there's no win-win situation, there's just lose-lose. And it's either lose in a horrible way, you know, for all of us, all the loss of life and the tragedy we've already got. And, you know, in some respects, Putin has already lost, right? But, you know, he's not going to see that. He's still saying that things have gone according to plan. He's lost a lot of things. You know, he's lost the position that Russia had in a global perspective. He had so much influence on the eve of his decision to invade. I mean, he was basically strong-arming. You know, I wrote an op-ed saying Putin's got us where he wants us. If he actually hadn't invaded, he would have done. Because, you know, kind of people were not really sure whether he was going to, but they gave him the benefit of the doubt of some of the issues that he was, you know, trying to emphasize. There's an awful lot of people like John Mearsheimer writing all these, you know, realist articles, you know, Putin's got a point about NATO, you know, all the rest of it. I'm sorry, nothing justifies the carnage that we're seeing today. Nothing. Whether he's upset about NATO or not. What, you know, this horror that is befalling the Ukrainian people, you know, I'm sorry, no justification. So Putin has already crossed a threshold into, you know, being, you know, one of the brutal, you know, dictators and, you know, all the kind of people. He'll go down in history in a very different way that he would have done before February 24th. So he's kind of lost, in a way, that legacy that he might have otherwise had. He has lost the Russian economy that he himself spent so much time building up over the last 20 years after basically inheriting a bankrupt country. And he has also lost the fellow feeling of Ukrainians, definitely for several generations, because of all these children, 1 million children who are refugees. I watched on Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, some clips, pretty very disturbing clips of refugee children who are being interviewed about, you know, their views of what's happening. And these kids, it's all translated into English, and it's, you know, refugee children. Some of them are, you know, as young as 4 or 5, about what they think the war is. And they're all talking about Putin. Why did he do this? You know, kind of, obviously they're picking it up from their grandparents and their parents, but here are 4 and 5-year-old kids, you know, who hopefully will have long years ahead of them, who are saying, why did Putin do this? Why did he come in and destroy Ukraine? And, you know, I grew up in Europe. I mean, quite a bit after World War II, right? I mean, I was born in 1965, so 20 years after the end of the war. But we were still going through reconciliation with Germany in Europe then. You know, 1975, when I was 10, the UK joined the EU. No, we're out of it. But I took part in all these exchanges, including an exchange to Germany when I was 13. My grandfather had fought in World War I, and my grandfather basically said, when I was in the school exchange, a German kid came to stay with my parents, and my grandfather wouldn't meet him. You know, my grandfather said he wanted nothing to do with any Germans. He wasn't going to meet the kid, who was really nice, you know, kid who was staying with my parents, and he thought it was appalling that my parents had sent me to Germany, because my parents thought it was important to try to reconcile. But my granddad's memories, going back to World War I and the slaughter, he was the only person from his class at school to survive the war, because he wasn't in the regiment from the local, he wasn't in the Durham Light Infantry, he joined the Royal Field Artillery. Every single one of his friends was killed. So, you know, that's what people are going to take away from that. That's why I say that there's no win for Putin here. But what we have to then is figure out a way that he looks like he's got something to sell at home. Because the one thing Putin is fearful of now is being deposed, being toppled. So we can't talk about, well, what people are, but we must not talk openly about regime change. This war only ends with the end of Vladimir Putin. We have to talk about how we end the war in Ukraine. Because Putin's the kind of person, over and over again, he knows exactly what happens to people like him, you know, who get on the losing side of something. They hang from a lamppost, or they're shot in a drainage pipe, or, you know, they're forced to take cyanide or shoot themselves in a bunker. He knows all of this. He talks about it all the time. So he's going to double and triple down until we're all so sickened of the slaughter in Ukraine that then we will just say, okay, that's enough. And so we've got to do our utmost on diplomacy. It's really going to be how we very artfully find a way, at least in the short to medium term, to give him a face-saving out. Zielinski's already trying this, right? So Zielinski's already said, look, we're not going to be in NATO. They don't want us. Why would we want to be there? We've already said that we're not going to be in NATO. But Putin is also demanding recognition of Crimea as part of Russia, and also the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk, and demilitarization of Ukraine and denazification of Ukraine. So we're going to have to really work at this, and we need this to be a big international effort. We need everybody on board on this. The UN frame, not just NATO, because he said, what's the role of NATO? We have to be very careful about this, because he wants to frame it all that way. We have to frame this as, this is the kind of thing where we're trying to end a major war. So we have to be laser focused on this and keep up with that diplomacy, keep up with those talks, and find some formula, even if it's temporary, to get this to stop.
I have so many questions that I want to ask you about all of that, and I also want to make sure that all of you have a chance to ask questions of our remarkable speaker. So please start thinking of them, and I'm going to ask you one more, perhaps, before we turn it over to all of you, which focuses more on your book, which is a bit of a pivot, I think, from what we're talking about in some ways, but in other ways, it's actually very connected. And I think one of the things that I found to be really remarkable about reading your book was really this kind of unexpectedness of having you sit in front of us tonight as one of the world's foremost experts on Russia, to see you working in the White House, at the National Security Council, and we learn in the book about your upbringing in the northeast of England, in a community that has experienced profound industrial decline, as the daughter of a coal miner and a nurse. And it struck me reading the book the importance of these two systems, both class and gender, in shaping your life and your career. And I wonder, and I think the book offers a lot of this, but I wonder if you can share with us a bit about how both class and gender and the inequality that exists profoundly, not only in the UK, but in the United States since you moved here, and also in so many other parts of the world, what we need to do, right, at this moment, because these are systems that underpin so many people's experiences. And I'm wondering what your perspective can really share with us about what values we should be centering in our own politics, in our own advocacy, in our own lives, as we look towards the near future.
Well, first of all, I just want to commend everybody here, because you're already doing it. So having the students here from the local high schools, this is it, because the way that I got a break in life was by being part of these kinds of organisations. The Rotary Club, the Durham Miners Association helped. Basically programs like this. The Girl Guides, the Girl Scouts was actually a really major, part of opening things up for me, and people like yourselves investing in that and being patrons of a lot of these organisations. But the real important thing to bear in mind is when we have inequality of opportunity. In some quarters that breeds a lot of grievance. And the common thing that we've had in our politics here in the United States, we had in the UK, but we also had in Russia, is people sort of feeling that they have been left out of their societies, that someone is doing not just better than them, but someone's having access to all kinds of things that are being denied to them. And when we've seen the rise of populism here in the United States, and we saw it in the UK as well, and Putin is a populist president, it's people who kind of step in and exploit all of that grievances, because if people feel that they've got no chance of just kind of making it on their own because there is too many barriers to opportunity, to entry into any field, basically on socioeconomic class levels or gender or race or where they live geographically. My whole area, if you kind of look at every outcome in the United Kingdom now, salaries, house prices, life expectancy, health, well-being, the north of England stands out as being just behind on absolutely everything, because for decades there's been no investment there and no attention being paid by the central government. And as a result of that, that's people voted for Brexit. They took us out of the European Union. And it wasn't because people want a handout, they want a hand up. I mean, people like me, when I was growing up, they didn't want you to give them money. They wanted just a chance to be able to go out and earn money, an education, an opportunity, for an experience. And then they do something with that themselves. And the kind of opportunities I had weren't scaled up for enough people. I took them all as soon as I saw them come along, but my sister didn't sometimes get the same opportunities I did because she's 2 years younger, and some of them had disappeared by the time she came along. Other people in my class didn't get them because there was only 1 or 2 students who would get selected for something. And in Russia, Putin's base of support, the people who have given him that support and continue actually to support him even during this war, they mostly come from all of the old Rust Belt, the old big tractor factories, tank factories of the Urals region, the war in the Donbass, that's the old Rust Belt, the old mining and steel part of Ukraine as well. And they basically put their support in Putin because he promised them a better life. He promised them bread and circuses and said, leave the politics to me. You'll get everything you want. You'll live like other people and just leave the politics to me. And that's the kind of problems that we all face here. We've got that too. Our own politicians say, you leave everything to me. I'll give you kind of a better life. And in that way we kind of cede our agency, our own kind of ability to do things. And so tackling opportunity, getting rid of those barriers is critical. But you're already doing it, by being part of World Affairs Councils and giving high school students from here, from different backgrounds, an opportunity. That's already part of it.
And as a team,
kudos
right?
to Deb
the
and
team
everybody.
sport.
Yeah, the team sport. So I said,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm incredibly grateful to people like you. I wouldn't be here doing any of these things if people hadn't, basically given me an assist somewhere along the line. And I'm trying to pay it back. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote the book, I've given away, the book advance to hardship funds, internships, and trying to give it back to all the people that helped me because, there's just no way I'd be sitting here with you tonight if people hadn't helped out.
In your reference to international unity, what role does the UN have in this?
In case those over here couldn't hear, in reference to international unity, what role does the United Nations have in this situation?
Well, I think this is a real test for the UN, and one that initially it's not doing so great on, right? I mean, this is the only framework that we have, indeed to foster international unity. And we've had, resolutions in the UN General Assembly. We've had a lot of countries abstaining, so sitting it out, or some handful voting against, what ought to be an obvious resolution condemning the invasion of Ukraine. A member of the General Assembly, recognised as independent sovereign for the last 30 years. And of course, we have a dilemma because of the structure of the UN Security Council, because we have China, we have Russia, in addition, to the United Kingdom, France, and the United States, the P5, the original 5 nuclear powers, and the victors of World War II. And of course, a lot of people have been pushing, I'm sure many of you here, we're in the State Department elsewhere, we need UN reform. But the UN, is the only institution we've got, and actually maybe as a result of this, we might kind of revitalise the UN. I don't know, I'm always hopeful. There's always the optimistic side of everything. But, the UN is really the only instrument that we have right now to be able to press ahead with this diplomacy. You have the UN institutions, for dealing with refugees, World Food Programme, because we're going to have a lot of problems as a result of this conflict, including for food security, Ukraine being a major producer of sunflower oil and grain, and there's going to be a lot of knock-on problems of this. So I think we have to, while we're trying to use the diplomatic forum of the United Nations, also push to really try to revitalise it, because this is precisely why we set up the United Nations. Just like the League of Nations after World War I was to basically make sure that something like this never happened again. And we haven't been the best at ensuring that, but the United Nations right now is all we've got, and we'd better really start to focus on it.
Thanks. We've got another question over here, and we're adjusting our microphones.
Dr. Hill, I have a question on the Air Force, the Ukrainian Air Force, and you partially talked about it. They have the same planes, so they're not able to determine who's the Russian planes and who their planes are. Did I pick that up from you?
I said it's very difficult, obviously in the heat of battle.
Yeah, so if they flew the pilots, the Ukraine pilots, to Poland or to another country to get the other jets, I'm not sure I understand why they're not doing that. So they could fly those jets to protect the airspace in Ukraine.
Yeah, but I think they're already then going to be flying those planes out of the airspace of a NATO country.
That's
So
the
that's
reason?
already, yeah, I mean, that's already, I mean, we were talking about this actually at MSU with Janine Davison, who's from the military and, used to be in the Air Force. And, you can't really kind of sneak a plane in, particularly easily. And,
They can't start from there and fly over.
well, they can, and then the Russians shoot them down. So that's kind of, and Putin has already said that armed convoys, kind of coming in, even by ground, are targets. So, we'd instantaneously enter into, this exact problem.
Our next question is right here.
Yeah.
So what is your view on what China is going to do to this whole situation?
Yeah, I'm thinking about this as well, and I'm not a China scholar. I mean, I hope we'll be able to get someone out here to talk to everyone as well, because, and I'm asking a lot of my colleagues about this who follow China very closely, and actually we've got a few people here who know China. China did something pretty astounding on February 4th, which is this joint statement and the agreement with Russia, in which they said their partnership, relationship knew no bounds, but also, for the very first time, were openly critical about the enlargement of NATO. So in other words, China made itself a player in European security and defence policy. And I think that, I don't know, have you ever had that in history, Richard? No, going back over no. I mean, I can't think of any, this is unprecedented. The Chinese also basically told the Russians, we've got your back. And so what the Russians did is they pulled troops. And this is, remember, Russia and China had a conflict over the demarcation of their border in 1969, in which they fired at each other. And a whole swathe of Russian territory north of the Amur River in the Russian Far East, places where Vladivostok and Khabarovsk and places like this are, was parts of China until the 1860s and was seized by the Russian Empire. So it's not like there aren't some tensions there. But the Russians were basically told by the Chinese, don't worry, we're not going to do anything. You can pull forces away from the border, which is the longest border that Russia has. And what they do, they take them over to the Ukrainian border, to Belarus, which they're using as a platform to launch this invasion. So China's responsible for this. And I think that that seems to be, from what I understand from talking to colleagues, causing a bit of discomfort now, because China always says that it's in favour of the independence and sovereignty and territorial integrity of the states, because that's why it gives its claim on Hong Kong, its claim on Taiwan, all the territories were pulled away by European colonial powers, or kind of broke away in the case of Taiwan from the Chinese mainland. And also China was the single largest country investor in Ukraine up until now. Not larger than the European Union, but larger than any other individual country, including, and most obviously, Russia. And the Chinese had no beef with Ukraine whatsoever. So this is really remarkable. And I think all of us are watching very closely about what China's going to do about this, because the more that this goes on, China was occupied by Japan during World War II. There was a mass slaughter of Chinese by Japanese occupation forces. We all have heard of the rape of Nanjing. Basically the laying waste to the city. And the Chinese haven't forgotten that. I'd be reminding them of this all the time. And because they've basically facilitated this. If Xi hadn't given, Putin, the green light, amber light, whatever, it kind of was at the time, he would have thought twice about basically launching a full-scale invasion.
Hi, so I've been paying a lot of attention to the sanctions that many countries have been employing against Russia. And it's made me wonder, I'm curious, I may have not noticed them, but in your opinion, should the U.S. have been sanctioned when we invaded Iraq?
Yeah, we probably should have been. On the same basis. And the problem with some of our own past conduct, even if it is in the past, is that Putin thinks that this then justifies what he's doing. So he engages in whataboutism. And he says, well, what about that? Now, of course, my grandma always said, 2 wrongs don't make a right, multiple wrongs don't make a right. So it still doesn't justify what he's doing. But basically, our own transgressions and, things that we've kind of done in the past, Putin will throw this all back at us. And in fact, he's often uses language that we've used for justification. And, I joined the National Intelligence Council in 2006. So 3 years after the invasion of Iraq. And, we were trying to improve our systems at that point to make sure that we weren't, kind of basically having faulty intelligence and, kind of basically coming up with false pretexts and justifications for things. So we have been cleaning up our acts. But, the Russians, in their view, and Putin, 2003 and the invasion of Iraq was a turning point for him as well, because he believed after that the United States had thrown the rule book out the window. He knew that the Iraqis and Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction. He knew they were bluffing. I mean, the Russians kind of pretty much told us it, but we kind of ignored it. And he then thought that the United States was just in the business of regime change. And so then we had the Arab Spring, and, we kind of watched when Hosni Mubarak, was removed from Egypt, and he was our partner. The Russians just couldn't understand this, other than that we were basically supporting regime change. Now, lots of things happened. We didn't start off the Arab Spring. We didn't start off the colour revolutions in Ukraine or Kyrgyzstan or Georgia either. But the fact that we, kind of basically, because, we were a revolutionary power ourselves. We cast off Great Britain. And, so whenever people, kind of rise up, we're always going, yep, we'll let that unfold. For Putin, he always thinks that the CIA is supporting anything in terms of protests at home in Russia or elsewhere around the world. He's still got that 1970s, early 1980s view of things. And so lots of things that we have done, just like, for the NATO enlargement, have fueled then his perspective. And he then gives him the right to do the same thing.
I have a question about the possibility of a palace coup in Moscow. Are people in power getting anxious enough to think about this? And then two, do we have people, the U.S. or NATO, are we somehow or other behind the scenes involved in attempting to depose Putin?
No, we're not. And we shouldn't be, just to be very clear here, because it gets back to what you just asked about Iraq and everything as well. And, the last time we deposed someone, Day in Iran, didn't go too well, did it? If we kind of think back to what happened in Iran after that, let's just say we have learned some lessons. We sometimes are quite slow in learning those lessons, but we absolutely have learned those lessons. Putin is absolutely paranoid about that question. He's asking that himself all the time. Why is he sitting at these great big long tables? It's not just because he's worried about getting COVID. He's also worried about, I was reading about Hitler bomb plot. Where, the von Stauffenbergs and others, appear and put a bomb in, and of course Hitler's sitting far enough away from it, but it doesn't affect him at all. But Putin knows about all that history. There's plenty of, he's presided over assassinations and poisonings. Alexei Navalny, they tried to poison him with, arms, weapon-grade nerve agent in his underpants. They've poisoned, people with polonium. Putin's presided over all kinds of assassinations of people. So he knows how this is done and how it can be done, in stealthy ways. And he is going to make sure that he roots out any risk whatsoever. And I'm sure he already thinks that we're trying to do that. Believe me, he will be out there, thinking, because he would do it, he thinks that we would be doing it too. So right now, he's looking for who he thinks might be doing this. And there's just going to be mass repression, a lot of suspicion on the people around him, Putin getting more and more isolated, because he fears exactly that, because Russian history is replete with palace coups. So, you can just be sure he's not sleeping well at night.
I wanted to thank you. Our son is from Kharkiv, Ukraine, and it's been particularly painful for us to watch this. But I wanted to get a little bit of a different picture. Russia's been involved with elections and stuff that's been going on in South America for years, Venezuela, and more recently in Bolivia, in Chile, and last week in Peru. So I wondered, is this the beginning, the end of a large empire, just like the Spain went through, England went through years ago? Is he biting off more than he can chew? And then what do we do as a country in the U.S. looking at that he's been in our back door for the past 20 years and we haven't done anything? Thank you.
I really do think he has, right? He's bitten off more than he can chew. Because even if he does, lay waste to Ukraine, he's not going to hold it and control it. And as I always said, there's going to be multiple generations here of enmity. No one in the neighborhood is ever going to trust Russia again. And it's going to be a tragedy for the Russian people as well. Because, again, this is one guy and a group of people around him. And it is exactly as, you're framing it here, a kind of a post-imperial grab. And, the UK and France did this in 1956 in Suez. We've seen plenty of these escapades and adventures. And, in this case, is especially bloody. And, Putin has tried to kind of leverage, some of the enmity that the United States has with, some of our neighbours from things that we've done in the past as well and tried to exploit that in Cuba and in Venezuela, as you spoke about, also Mexico. When we don't have a really coherent policy and a positive policy towards our neighbours, and in the case of Mexico, for example, we focus on drugs and guns and, we don't actually have a really robust policy to our, southern neighbour. The Russians try to move in and, try to manipulate that and take advantage of it. The one thing that Russians always do is try to, again, I don't want to say Russians as the Russian people, just to be very clear again, the Kremlin and the people, kind of around Putin is always try to exploit friction. Maybe that in our domestic politics or in our relations with others, and try to see what they can do with it. So we have to prove, all of us through diplomacy and through this, international effort to stop this war, that Putin has gone further than he should have done. That, say no to these kind of post-imperial, revisionist adventures that not just Putin has done, but that others might be contemplating. That's why we need to get back to the UN system, which was supposed to be preventing that. And we also have to think about how we're going to re-engage with countries where we've let our relationships deteriorate and that the Russians have tried to exploit those relations. I think we have to reinvigorate our own diplomacy and our own sets of relationships and think of them afresh. And we've got a lot of former State Department representatives here who've done their best possible job to represent the United States. We need to get more people, the young people who are here today, to join the Foreign Service and to really have a positive frame in which the United States is going to engage. Go back to how we were after World War II in the United States, really kind of reaching out to countries in a positive way. We'll have that opportunity if we can get an end to the war in Ukraine to do that.
Thank you for your insight this evening. Looking at it economically, they've stated that Russia has 600 plus billion in cash and gold reserves. It's also been said that Putin has enriched himself tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions. From an economic perspective, does the Soviet population understand that and what he has done and has he truly enriched himself to that degree?
We're pretty sure he has, although I'm not sure whether we know exactly to what degree. But there's one thing to bear in mind is that the Kremlin owns an awful lot of property. So as president of Russia, he can avail himself of all kinds of things. They've got yachts and palaces and dachas and all kinds of property. The Kremlin has actually a property agency. And Putin's first job after he'd been deputy mayor of St. Petersburg was to go to run that agency. So he's got a pretty good inventory of all of the kinds of things. They lease planes, they have fleets of cars, they have the Kremlin, they have all of these, different palaces, and as president he can do whatever he likes in all of these. And then, it's obviously very clear, there's been a lot of investigative journalists. There's Alexei Navalny, who showed us Putin's palace on the Black Sea, completely remember with the pole dancing and the casinos and his old private vineyard and all kinds of bizarre things. That, Putin has taken some things for himself, but it's not in his name, right? You're not going to have Vladimir Putin on the deed to that palace. It's all through shell companies and, different names. And now we're finally tracking down that money and those different ways and pathways in which Putin can avail himself of, many of these pleasures and palaces. It's like Kubla Khan and the Pleasure Dome. This is kind of the life of Vladimir Putin. And Alexei Navalny and, investigative journalists have been looking for this. I don't think we can necessarily put a dollar figure on it, because a lot of it is just sort of things, chips that we can call in. There's this kind of yacht, the super yacht that people are looking at, right now. But, a lot of the things that have happened with sanctions and now follow the money are really going to be cutting a lot of that off. Now, the question is, will that really matter to Putin? It'll matter to some people. But it won't necessarily matter to the hard men around Putin who, were never really into that anyway, but are all into, kind of Russian power. Putin's trying to spin it to the Russians now that, this getting cut off from the world economy is going to make them stronger. Not so sure about that. But it's also going to take, I think, quite a while for it to sort of sink in, the economic impact. So, it's going to be a while yet before Putin and the people around him really start to feel the pressure from this. Well, the thing is that all the way through time, unfortunately we've seen that time Putin's been in power, these revelations about his wealth haven't really affected people. In part because he's been giving them the promise of bread and circuses, the classic, Roman Empire kind of approach to things. But now, the bread in form of McDonald's, the circuses in form of sporting and cultural events, those are going to get getting cut off. So it's not so much about what he has, but what they don't have. Because Putin was basically saying, again, you cede the politics and the security to me. I'll be, the great champion of Russia on the world stage, but you'll enjoy yourselves at home. And for the last 20-odd years, Russians have been living their best lives. Not everyone, of course. If we go off into the sticks in Russia, some things haven't changed for centuries. But in big cities like Moscow, these are world cities, St. Petersburg, out in the regions that have been prospering from oil and gas. And that's not going to be the case. Now, Putin thinks that Russians can put up with a lot. But anyone who was born after the fall of the Soviet Union has not experienced the grind of older people. And even people of my age in their 50s, they were kind of living, their youth in the 1990s. There was a lot of hope and a lot of change. And their kids know nothing about all of this deprivation. They really don't. So let's see. And I don't say this with any pleasure. I think this is an absolute tragedy. This is a tragedy for the Russian people. It's a horror for the Ukrainians. And this is the fault of one man who, was obviously clearly planning some kind of weird retirement in this, crazy palace down on the Black Sea.
Thank you. We've got 3 questions on this side, and then our final question of the evening is coming from one of our high school students on the other end.
Oh, great.
So I'll try to make this quick, but there are several analysts who see a lot of groundswell of them saying that most likely with the rainy season getting worse coming up, the problems that Russia's already had are only going to be exacerbated. So we're going to see more and more problems in that. We're also going to see a groundswell of more and more civilians being killed. With these analysts, a lot of them, they're saying the biggest problem is we're seeing a lot of vets, former soldiers especially. The Ukrainian soldiers have already gone over. But we're seeing a lot of guys, even in their independent ready reserve, that are talking about arming up and getting over there. If we start to see that, that could be another trigger for that war that we were talking about that's going to have to take us in with Americans dying on soil, especially if they're veterans, or even worse, if they're reservists in uniform. So kind of as that being discussed at these higher levels and what we expect to do to kind of tamp that down, if you will, or figure out how we're going to control that in the long run.
Well, this is like the Spanish Civil War, where you had an awful lot of people volunteering, the international brigade. They weren't there on the part of their governments because there was an embargo and a non-intervention pact. So it depends, whether they're going in an official format, which, right now they're not. And look, the Russians took Crimea with forces without insignia. And, kind of basically, they use a lot of paramilitaries and covert operatives. And in the case of Donbass, Russian forces were there as volunteers. They were there on their vacations, having a weekend away, shooting at people in the Donbass. So, the Russians are going to, think no matter what that, we're doing the same thing. So that is already something that we do have to be talking about and about the escalated potential for it. But you may have noticed that the US government and other governments are actually asking people not to do this. Now, it's because it's one of the Ukrainians, kind of coming back to bite, and there are an awful lot of Ukrainians, but there is that indeed escalatory risk from having, people there, on the ground from, with military experience from other armed forces, the kind of French Foreign Legion or International Brigade style. Now, we don't know actually, though, what information the Russians have from the ground, because, look, again, they're fighting. This isn't Spain fighting Franco. This is in Ukraine fighting Russians there. And it may be also that the Russians don't have full information about this. So it's kind of also somewhat unpredictable. We also seem to be getting basically Russian forces saying, I'm not doing this. We don't know, quite how that is going to play out. But, the larger point that analysts are looking at now is this, how fluid the battlefield is and how things can go in all kinds of unpredictable ways. And we don't know what the end game is going to be. And that's gets back to your point here. We don't know how this is going to end.
Hello, Dr. Hill. Sorry, get used to these things. I would like to know what you see as the future for the other non-NATO former Eastern Bloc countries that are there after peace, in whatever way it comes.
Well, we're certainly going to be thinking about other ways of defending them, that's for sure, after this. I think, actually one of my colleagues at Brookings, Michael O'Hanlon, wrote a book a couple of years ago called Beyond NATO, already realising that NATO wasn't going to be the catch-all solution for defence for countries like you're suggesting here that were already outside. There have been some countries in the Western Balkans that were already kind of slated for entry into NATO that may still go on that path afterwards. But you can certainly be sure that there will be a lot of resistance to the demilitarization of places like Ukraine, and a lot of countries rethinking their neutral position. Even if they're not in NATO, neutrality doesn't seem like any kind of, let's just say, defense against aggression. And actually the most neutral country probably in Europe is Ireland. And I don't know if any of you remember this story just before the invasion, that the Russians decided to have a naval exercise, clearly a preparation for this, in the Atlantic Ocean, in the economic zone of Ireland. Now, Ireland is so neutral that it only has 4 Coast Guard ships. And it has some special forces that usually take part in UN and other, kind of missions. And it has some training planes. So, Ireland doesn't even have a military. And, the way that the Russians were pushed back was from Irish fishermen complaining and basically saying, well, look, we're not going to, this is our economic zone, we're going to continue fishing. So, sorry, whoever you are in the Russian Navy, you're going to get in our fishing grounds and we're going to be out there. And their pushback actually caused the Russians to pull back. And then the Russian Foreign Ministry accused Ireland of aggression. So I think the message from all of this for Europeans, no matter where they are, is neutrality is not a great protection. And after this, there's going to be an awful lot of talk and a lot of creativity and creative thinking about, and Zielinski's also asking for this, about other forms of defence. So my colleague Michael Hannon's work on Beyond NATO is obviously going to find its moment that it didn't necessarily a couple of years ago when he wrote that book.
Thank you for being here, Dr. Hill. The presentation is great. During your presentation, I was wondering if there's an inner circle at all who have the ear of President Putin. Last night I watched the Frontline presentation, a lot of people did. And they showed him meeting with his cabinet just before the decision to invade. Everybody was, like you said, 50, 70 feet away, and then they stood up one at a time and all said exactly what he wanted to hear. My thought was, is there anyone he would listen to who's close enough to him that would be able to whisper, this is not going the way we want it to go?
Yeah, that's the real dilemma that we're all trying to figure out. There was an interesting piece in the New York Times by a Russian analyst, Mikhail Zigar, who wrote a book called All the Kremlin's Men, which was kind of looking at the Russian inner circle. And he basically said that, one of the oligarchs, Mr. Kovalchuk, who Putin has known, for years, has his ear, but unfortunately he seems to be the person who's dreamed up with Putin the invasion of Ukraine. Putin does listen, or has in the past, to his Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu. And, does Shoigu now, Shoigu used to be the Minister of Emergencies. This seems to be a bit of an emergency. Does Shoigu, have the temerity to tell him this isn't going well? Or does Shoigu think it's going well? This is part of the problem. It seems that Putin is not listening to his heads of intelligence. So they are Mr. Narishkin. He was a guy who was quite hesitant about, didn't clearly know what the script was supposed to be. And there was a lot of thinking about, what does that mean? Putin's the kind of shoot the messenger guy. And I've been, in that role of being the messenger, bad news, warning. It's not that easy to get people's attention. And, kind of even if they're not going to shoot you, it's very problematic to get across, people don't often give you the time to explain it all out. I mean, this is like an analyst's dream, basically here, you guys ask me a question, I go on, for 5-10 minutes, I've obviously gone on too long, but when in a setting with a president or a vice president or something like that, you get maybe 5 seconds, they might cut you off. Or they might tell you, well, sorry, you're not with the policy. I had that with Vice President Cheney. We're kind of giving him a piece of analysis he didn't like. He said, well, you're not with the policy. We're like, well, that wasn't our role, but obviously wasn't listening. We're going to say, no, this isn't going to happen. And he was just like, I don't care. We're going to do something else. So that's the problem with Putin. He might actually have people who are saying, no, sorry, this isn't working, but he might say, well, I don't care. And we know that with his the head of his central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, and his prime minister, there was another televised meeting, with his economics team. They're all sitting like that. They're like head in their hands going, oh my God, what do we do with this? And he's basically saying to them, figure it out. I'm not changing course, so figure it out. He did that in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. Some of his economics team said, well, look, we need to get rid of sanctions because we can't, turn the economy around. He said, well, sanctions aren't going anywhere because I'm not changing course, so you'll have to adapt. So that's the kind of problem. So when does it become clear to him that you can't adapt is really the kind of question. And I can't say when that is.
And our last question is over here.
Oh, great.
Once again, thank you so much for all of your time here tonight. And I've heard discussion that part of Putin's motivation could be looking into an expansion of Russian manufacturing. Yeah. Could this be part of his motivation? And beyond the scope of the current conflict, what would expanded Russian manufacturing mean for Russia's presence in the global economy?
Well, it's actually a really good question because Putin has been trying to find a way before this of revitalizing, the Russian economy. And part of this was to expand, actually, the manufacturing of arms. Just like we have our own military-industrial complex, and we have, Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, and kind of a lot of Boeing that does dual-use, kind of aircraft and engines, for example. Putin was actually seeing the future of Russian manufacturing being in this, kind of creation of dual-use technology in the defense sector. And sometimes war's good for business, right? Because you use up a lot of equipment, ammunitions and missiles, and you have to continue to make more of them. Sometimes it's extraordinarily bad for business, however. And, in the old days, in the Soviet period, a lot of defense industry was in Ukraine. The Antonovs, the huge heavy lift aircraft, were all made in Ukraine. And in fact, the biggest plane in the world, the Mira, was bombed by the Russians, and it's an aircraft hangar. This was the Antonov aircraft. I can't even say how big this was. I mean, you could get more things than you can possibly imagine into this plane. There's only one of them in the world. It was made in Ukraine. The Russians seem to have almost destroyed it in a bombing raid. So I think that actually was, part of the motivations, kind of maybe, partly to pull back in some of the Ukrainian manufacturing sector back into the Russian orbit. The Chinese actually at one point were trying to buy one of the industrial plants, Motor Sich, which made a lot of the motors in Ukraine, for example, and the Russians weren't actually thrilled by it. We weren't thrilled by it. We actually, the United States, we were kind of trying to move to stop that from happening. But at this, particular point, I don't think if Putin really had those ambitions, that these are really going to have worked out, because part of the manufacturing really depends on components from the West, and one of our key sanctions has been cutting that off. Russia can't, create the microchips, a lot of the key components, even from its own military equipment. And they're going to have a really hard time in the future, revitalizing their manufacturing sector if they remain in the current pariah state that they are now. But thank you for that question. It's great, and I'm really glad you're here, and congratulations to you and all of your colleagues from taking part in the challenge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to thank Dr. Hill and Dr. Berry for being here tonight, and also thank Hearthstone Books, who has Dr. Hill's current book for sale, and she's graciously agreed to sign those for you, as well as you can purchase those this evening. So we will give her a moment to get out there, and thank you again for being here. Drive safely.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thanks so much, everybody.